The 7th Fleet, a component of the United States Navy, often goes by the same name. Its primary base of operations is situated in Yokosuka, Japan, and it functions directly under the supervision of the Pacific Fleet. March 15, 1943, in Brisbane, Australia, during the World War II era, saw the inauguration of this naval sector. Its key responsibility was to maintain a presence in the Southwestern Pacific Ocean, facing off against the formidable Japanese Imperial Navy under the direct leadership of the famous General Douglas MacArthur. It is less known that the majority of the Royal Australian Navy's battleships were also directed by the 7th Fleet from 1943 to 1945. During the same time frame in World War II, the 7th Fleet held an essential position within the Allied forces, especially in the decisive Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. This conflict, one of the largest naval battles in recorded history, marked a pivotal moment that shifted the trajectory of the war, pushing Japan towards a crushing loss. Following the unconditional surrender of Japan, the 7th Fleet was entrusted with disarming and occupying Japanese military forces and subsequently established its dominance in the land of the rising sun. Eventually, the 7th Fleet moved its base to Formosa, Taiwan, and by January 1, 1947, it had adopted the new name of the Western Pacific Task Force. The transition of its bases initiated at the culmination of 1948, relocating from Formosa to the Philippines. Here, the U.S. military built an array of new infrastructure facilities at Subic Bay and an airfield at Sangley Point. Post-war operations of the 7th Fleet were overseen by Admiral Arthur Radford, who held the position of Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. However, the Far East Fleet's commander would assume operational control in instances involving operations near Japanese waters or in emergency scenarios. The force officially adopted the name Task Force 7 on August 19, 1949, which was later condensed to Task Force 7, as it is recognized today. Task Force 7's strength is drawn from a variety of specialized task groups, each designed to execute a broad spectrum of combat missions. First, the Mixed Task Group 70, serving as the core of the combat force, consists of 2 aircraft carriers along with about 15 various warships. In reality, the USS Ronald Reagan, CVN-76 aircraft carrier, is the one that operates regularly, and another aircraft carrier will be assigned based on mission requirements for approximately 6 months at a time. Next is the Mixed Task Group 71, which is the command and coordination center of Task Force 7, consisting of 5 smaller task units, namely 71, 1, 71, 2, 71, 3, 71, 6, and 71, 7. Among these, 71, 1 functions as the amphibious task unit, 71. 2 is responsible for intelligence gathering, 71. 3 handles air traffic control and provides air defense information, 71. 6 is responsible for mission coordination, training, and exercises, while 7 specializes in monitoring and special operations. Task Group 72, stationed in Misawa, Japan, is responsible for maritime patrol and reconnaissance missions. This is a highly sensitive combat reconnaissance unit that conducts daily maritime patrol and reconnaissance tasks, immediately escalating surveillance activities when the situation changes. The main force of this task group is the P-3C aircraft, equipped with a sonar system, anti-submarine warfare capabilities, search and rescue missions, and acting as a communications relay station. In addition, logistics support is provided by Mixed Task Group 73, responsible for repair and supply support. The group mainly consists of oilers, ammunition ships, and other logistics support vessels. A highly renowned and perhaps the most secretive unit is the Mixed Task Group 74, featuring a range of modern submarines that, in combination with surface ships of Task Group 75, form a formidable force that can strike fear into any nation by just being mentioned. There are also units like Task Group 76, consisting of minesweepers and mine countermeasure ships. Task Group 77, responsible for anti-submarine warfare and supporting aircraft carriers. And Task Group 79, tasked with amphibious landings and deploying the most elite Marines of the United States. These units showcase the immense scale and highly organized structure of the entire 7th Fleet, living up to its reputation as one of the most powerful fleets on the planet. Following its establishment and the turbulent phases of World War II, the warships of Task Force 7 actively participated in the Korean War from 1950, supporting South Korean forces in repelling North Korean and Chinese Communist forces. Notable battleships such as the Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin played key roles throughout the conflict. In the following decades, the 7th Fleet was involved in various combat operations in Laos in 1959 and Thailand in 1962. From the fall of 1960 to January 1961, this force deployed a series of aircraft carriers and numerous combat ships to the South China Sea. By the end of April 1961, most of the 7th Fleet had been deployed off the coast of the Indochina Peninsula in preparation for military interventions in Laos. This force included aircraft carriers like the Coral Sea and Midway, which were used to provide air support, as well as the anti-submarine warfare support carrier Kearsarge. In the beginning, there was a helicopter aircraft carrier, 3 amphibious assault groups, 2 submarines, and 3 Marine Corps battalion landing teams. A few years later, as the situation on the Indochina battlefield, particularly in Vietnam, became increasingly complex, with prolonged heavy losses suffered by the U.S. military, it led to a change in the Pentagon's combined warfare strategy, which involved sea and land. Specifically, a crucial mission during the combat operations of the 7th Fleet was to provide support, fire support, and naval air support for U.S. ground forces fighting along the coastal regions of our country. To accomplish this, the 7th Fleet utilized naval aviation, Marine Corps ground forces, and various artillery and missile assets. The most robust fire support missions took place during the period from 1965 to 1966, when U.S. tactical aircraft in South Vietnam had not yet been completed, and only a few major airfields were operational. Mixed Special Operations teams began providing fire support for ground troops in South Vietnam in April 1965. To fulfill this mission, an aircraft carrier group and combat ships were deployed in the Southern Sea area, an operational zone called Dixie, divided into 2 tactical zones. In these tactical zones, smaller aircraft carrier groups closely patrolled the Vietnamese coastline with a distance of only 40 nautical miles. Due to the battlefield conditions in South Vietnam, as well as the guerrilla warfare tactics used by the People's Liberation Army, most of the combat operations took place during the day. However, due to the escalating intensity of the conflict, U.S. military forces had to start conducting missions at night. Gradually, the number of night sorties increased to 40% of the total missions. Before each aircraft took off, the aircraft carrier had to turn its bow into the wind, increase its speed for takeoff, and prepare 2 rescue helicopters for immediate takeoff, positioned on the right and left of the aircraft carrier at an altitude of 50 meters. The aircraft took off, one by one, with a 1-minute interval between daytime sorties and about 1 minute and 30 seconds at night. The takeoff sequence was as follows: Airborne Early Warning and Control Aircraft, AWACS, Electronic Warfare Aircraft, Reconnaissance Aircraft, Fighter Aircraft, and finally, Bomber Aircraft. Unlike in Hollywood war movies, the process of launching and recovering aircraft on an aircraft carrier is quite complex and expensive. The time required for a squadron to take off could be up to 40 minutes. After taking off from the aircraft carrier, the planes climbed to an altitude of 1,500 to 2,500 meters, formed combat formations, and headed to the combat area. During the flight to the target, combat aircraft traveled at a speed of about 900 kilometers per h and an altitude of 5,000 meters. Typically, the combat formations were in the shape of a V, an arc, or a horizontal line, with reconnaissance aircraft leading the way, combined with fighter aircraft. The combat formation had a width of about 1,300 meters and a length of up to 1,500 meters for a squadron of combat aircraft. During that time, the enemy's anti-aircraft capabilities in South Vietnam, particularly in the southern region, were relatively weak, so U.S. strike aircraft could operate relatively comfortably. Usually, U.S. pilots drop bombs in pairs, with a separation distance of 450 meters between planes, and the distance between formations varied from 10 to 15 seconds. The aircraft typically initiated their dive at an altitude of about 800 to 1,000 meters. When there were no signs of strong enemy air defenses, they would form a circle and take turns diving at a 45-degree angle. However, some fighter aircraft conducted dive attacks at altitudes of 200 to 300 meters. Some American pilots paid a price for their recklessness at this altitude, as their aircraft were vulnerable to 12.7 mm anti-aircraft machine guns. It was only in 1972, when the Soviet Strela II shoulder-fired missiles appeared on the battlefield, that American pilots stopped flying this way. U.S. aircraft would return to the aircraft carrier at altitudes ranging from 800 to 3,000 meters in combat formations or small groups. In many cases, they would return individually. The average landing cycle during the day was from 1 to 1.5 minutes and up to 3 minutes at night. Unlike in World War II, the battlefield conditions in South Vietnam were highly dynamic. and the combat situation constantly changed with complex and overlapping tactical zones. This forced the United States to adapt to non-traditional combat methods. On-call fire support was the most agile form of fire support for U.S. troops in sudden ambushes and unprepared encounters. Close air support was highly effective, with tactical aircraft responding to ground force fire support needs while in the process of executing combat missions on the runway. To enhance the effectiveness of fire support, by the end of 1965, fire support aircraft on aircraft carriers transitioned from on-runway combat to on-air combat. This method reduced the time to reach the combat area required for fire support and air support. During the peak of the combat intensity, when U.S. units faced high-frequency, high-intensity enemy attacks, the U.S. military established an additional combat air control center. In the tightly organized and responsive operational conditions, from the request for fire support to the aircraft starting the support mission, the record time was 10 minutes. In addition, general fire support is usually planned during search and destroy operations or other sweep campaigns. General fire support is typically carried out according to pre-planned schedules based on the requirements of the Ground Force Command. Airstrikes can be executed under the guidance of ground-forward air controllers in the airspace. In some special cases, pilots may operate under free fire mode, mainly in the Mekong Delta or the southern part of South Vietnam. The battlefield in South Vietnam was the first instance where the U.S. Air Force used radio-guided target marking for ground attacks. The information was gathered and processed using onboard computers on strike aircraft such as the A-6 Intruder to accurately determine target areas and conduct attacks, even in low visibility or adverse weather conditions. These aircraft usually carried out missions on a request basis, while other fighter aircraft operated according to pre-planned combat plans. Apart from using the Air Force for fire support, Task Force 77 of the 7th Fleet also established a fire support battleship group consisting of various missile battleships and cruisers. Within this group, a heavy cruiser, 2 or 3 guided missile cruisers, and approximately 10 destroyers and escort ships were typically included. As the strategic offensives of the Viet Cong intensified, the number of fire support ships also increased. Since the Vietnam battlefield had no clear front lines, the U.S. Navy had to redeploy between 2 and 3 cruisers to the conflict areas. The primary targets of naval gunfire were air defense artillery positions, ground transportation routes, suspected enemy concentration areas, enemy command posts, and enemy arsenals. To conduct fire support missions, naval gunfire ships carried out shore bombardments from 9 to 11 kilometers from the coast. However, from 1967, when the coastal artillery of the Viet Cong began to attack the battleships, the combat radius of the fire support ships increased from 10 to 20 kilometers. The most iconic example of the destructive power of Task Force 77's firepower was the USS New Jersey, a battleship which fired nearly 20,000 large and small caliber shells into coastal areas of Vietnam from Quang Tri to Thanh Hoa during its time of service in the conflict. This equates to around 5,688 rounds of 406 mm shells and 14,891 rounds of 127 mm shells, surpassing the combined total fired in World War II and the Korean War. It was truly devastating and has resulted in severe long-term consequences that are yet to be fully addressed. After the Vietnam War, the units of Task Force 77 participated in various different campaigns, such as India-Pakistan or Gulf War. At present, their role is to ensure security for American cargo transport routes across the Pacific, as well as to protect allies such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and carry out operations to deter China in light of the complex developments in the South China Sea. Recently, the U.S. government, as well as Task Force 77, have conducted many goodwill visits to Asian countries with the aim of building regional peace, cooperation, and sustainable development. Among these visits, the U.S. Navy's aircraft carrier, USS Carl Vinson, the guided missile cruiser, USS Lake Champlain, and the guided missile destroyer, USS Wayne Meyer, visited the city of Da Nang in March 2018. According to military experts, with its position as one of the most powerful task forces globally, the Pacific Fleet of the U.S. Navy, including Task Force 77, has been, and will continue to be, the primary force of the U.S. Navy in both a deterrence and combat role in any conflicts or crises that may arise in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Now that we have delved into the exploration of Task Force 77 of the U.S. Navy, who do you think can contend with this task force? Please share your opinions in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.